where we'll be looking at the outcomes of the IMI program GetReal. Today we'll be discussing how real-world evidence can be used to determine the effectiveness of new therapies and get a general overview as to how GetReal has been proceeding in this, its final year. I'll be joined today by three of the people leading the charge on GetReal's Work Package 1. They are Sarah Gardner and Paul Janssen of NICE. Good afternoon.
Hello.
Hello. Hello, thank you. As well as Rob Thwaites of Takeda. Hello, Rob.
Hi there.
All right, and we're all here. And again, we are very grateful for you being here. Before we go any further, all of us sitting here safely in London, we do send out our very best wishes to all of our friends and colleagues in Brussels, to whom we work very closely with whom. Yesterday was certainly not a great day for any of us, but we forge on, and we thank you all for being here. Life moves forward, and this is an important project, and I'm very grateful for all of you, the hundreds of you who've tuned in. Just so you know, we've had 470 registrations for this webinar, which is a new record, and we're very grateful for your participation. Now, before we get cracking, all of us in many guises and situations have had to deal with bad webinar connections and internet connections, so we have options and tools for you. Given the amount of traction this webinar has had, it would be physically impossible for us to open the microphones and take personal comments, so we are going to have to do things slightly differently. If you're having a question, please feel free to raise your hand, and I will endeavor to get back to you in a chat function. The webinar does have a chat function. If you're having internet problems, we've provided over 24 international dial-in numbers. You can switch to a phone, and there's a little setting in audio mode between use mic and speakers and use the internet. If you're having internet problems and you're in the internet, please feel free to switch over to the phone. And then we'll be taking questions. We're going to run a question log, and at the end we will have time to answer your questions. So please feel free to submit them. They'll be logged. We can archive them, and those we cannot answer today, we will get back to you. We will archive those and answer those. We have all of your email addresses, and we will reach out. One final thing before we get started, we'd like to, this is the final year of GetReal, and we'd like to highlight a few activities that we have coming up. The first thing is we will be doing on the 18th a live broadcast from Takeda's offices, where we'll be introducing the concept of how to deal with effectiveness, basically. And then on the 10th of May we'll be doing another webinar, and that'll be looking at meta-analysis, which is very interesting. And then we'll have the first live event here in London at the Digital Catapult on June 17th. We are limited in space, so if you folks want to come along to that, I highly suggest that you keep an eye on that. We'll be sending out a save the date. And you can get all this information on the two websites, the IMI GetReal website or at vitaltransformation.com. Please feel free to access on either of those websites. So with that, we're very grateful to have Sarah and Paul here, and I'm going to pass the lectern over to Sarah.
About how a particular drug stacked up against current options and how it performed in the real world, so they could start making decisions about availability in various jurisdictions. And not surprising from a company's perspective, this was caused a lot of head scratching. Very used to producing large RCTs, but now we're going to need a different sort of data. We're going to need to provide evidence for different sorts of questions. So HTA very much seen, or effectiveness, and the HTA agencies that are asking the questions very much seen as a fourth hurdle to market access. Next slide, please, Diane. Thank you. This slide just starts to unpick how we've been working in evidence-based medicine for a very long time. On the left-hand side, we see the hierarchy of evidence that's been established, I think, for the last 25 years now. And it was always previously put that systematic reviews, meta-analysis and RCTs were placed at the top. The implication being that the evidence from them was better. It outstripped every sort of other evidence, particularly that from observational studies, which were seen to be very, very biased, very messy. So we've had that for a long time, and the world is changing. People are starting to question whether that is necessarily the case. We have good RCTs, we have bad RCTs. We have observational studies that provide vital information, particularly for pharmacovigilance purposes. And we're now moving to an era whereby we're stripping it all back and looking at the science, and making sure we use the best study design to answer the question that's at hand, rather than make sweeping generalizations about hierarchies and placements of different types of studies. So again, stripping it very much back to those scientific basis. And this slide very much talks about the difference between efficacy and effectiveness, and why it's so important we start to understand what those differences are. Efficacy, data from standard RCT studies. The populations that are included in RCTs are necessarily very, very clean. The aim being to strip out all differences between those populations apart from the intervention and the comparator that you're studying. So any other differences would be randomization. So you control things very tightly. You don't expose patients who are predisposed to harm unnecessarily. So you take out elderly patients that have comorbidities, and you take out any pregnant women. So very, very clean population, and the idea is you have high internal validity to minimise any biases. But that comes at a price. So the resulting data, it's difficult to generalise beyond the study population and the exact parameters have been used. But on the other hand, if you open up the studies to a more diverse set of patients that probably represent more the population, the final population that's going to be receiving the drug.
Sarah, if I can just jump in, we understand we're having some internet problems here, and we're having issues with people seeing Sarah's slides. We understand that Sarah's slides are running late. We're very sorry about that. We've had an internet problem. We've had an internet dropout. We are now caught up with the slides, and we will keep an eye on that. I apologize. We will be sending the slide pack out afterwards. I've changed the internet configuration here. Hopefully now we will keep up. So I'm very sorry about that. Sarah, please continue.
Please bear with it. So effectiveness studies, you want a more generalizable population. You want it to represent those that are actually going to be receiving the drug, but it comes at a price. The data is much more dirty. It's got a lot of variability in it, a lot of biases, which you need to control for. You perhaps need much bigger sample sizes to make sure you get more precision in your estimates. So there's no easy win, there's no one solution. And for HTA agencies, what does that mean? So when we're actually looking to evaluate the effectiveness of drugs, the implications that if we just have the regulatory trials, these come up quite a lot, is that actually you're wanting to look at longer term effects and phase 3 trials, typically 6 weeks, 12-week studies. You're trying to infer from them the longer term effects, and again it's not sensible in this day and age for HTA agencies to keep asking for longer studies. That might be what we want, but those trials are very expensive to run, they're very logistically challenging, so all that will happen is we're just going to increase prices. So that's not a trade-off that we need, and we want to find a way through it. And finally, you might end up with event rates. You might have a source of data from real-world evidence and another source of data from phase 3 trials, and actually the event rates aren't comparable between the two data sources, which causes a lot of discussion and debate. So it's not easy. Either way, it's not easy. And my last slide, what we're hoping to get out of participating in GetReal, these, if you like, are some of the deliverables that I see that go beyond what we're committed to deliver, is really importantly is throughout this project we've got a shared understanding of the technical and processes issues that each stakeholder has. So we get really in-depth understanding of perhaps the decision-making process in companies, how they actually trials are chosen, where the source of development pathways is, and what has actually gone into those decisions. For companies, and I'll let Rob speak to that later, maybe is understanding better about how HTA decision-making operates, and what actually gets taken into account, and what potential role of real-world data might be. For the first time, we've sat down, we've had competitors who are producing drugs in particular disease areas, and we've been able to sit in a room and talk about the challenges that that we have, and Pal's going to talk through some of those disease areas. And we've been able to get a shared understanding of things like, the need for a natural history cohort, so we can actually understand the natural progression of the disease and the absence of one. So we can actually then look towards a future research agenda. We've been able to explore some new method solutions. We've been looking, and again, my colleagues are going to talk a little bit more about this. We've been looking at integrating real-world evidence into network meta-analysis, as an example, and looking at the impact that has on the estimates that we're producing. And then we importantly be able to look at the acceptability of those new methodological techniques for different stakeholders. So we had regulators, HTA agencies and industry talking through the pros and cons of network meta-analysis. Our final deliverable, we're going to have a compilation of best practice recommendations. At the moment, there's numerous sources of recommendations, so we're going to pull them all together in one place and signpost for everybody who's recommending what, and produce some commentary on how they relate and how to actually pick through that morass of recommendations. It's been a 3-year project. We're not finished. It's going to be great sadness we're going to end at the end of 3 years, but we've established a really good research agenda, are going to give some very clear signals to FTA and IMI about what we feel should be done next, either in other future IMI projects or other arenas. But the most important thing to me is the collaboration and trust we've built up over the last 3 years. We've been working together in new ways. I think we've come to a better understanding of each other as stakeholders, and now have avenues forward in which we can explore other projects. And I'm delighted with the Big Data for Better Outcomes initiative, which is taking forward some of the great work we've done in GetReal. And I'll finish there.
Thank you, Sarah. Again, we're very aware that we're having significant internet connection problems here at NICE. We are doing everything we can. I'm trying to advance the slides ahead of people, but we are aware that the slides are lagging. We're doing what we can. We will send out the slides afterwards if we do end up jumping around. Again, we're very, very sorry about that. Unfortunately, there's not much we can do. We're having internet connection trouble. So I'd like to now pass the dais over to Paul Johnson. Paul, again, thank you very much for hosting us here, and please do a good job doing an interpretive dance around your slides.
Thank you, Dwayne. It's going to be a challenge. I appreciate it's probably difficult for the listeners to follow properly, but I'll do my best. So as said, let's discuss some of the challenges in terms of using data, different study designs to answer different questions. I am going to just give you a brief overview of what the GetReal project is doing around that to help us answer some of these questions and provide guidance on what to do in terms of when you want to consider using real-world data to answer effectiveness questions. Just to start by saying that the GetReal project is an IMI project, Innovative Medicines Initiative project, and one of the key sort of features of these projects is that they're public-private partnerships. So essentially what we've got here is European pharma companies coming together with public partners in Europe, and these public partners include academia, organizations such as HTA organizations, regulators, and so on. Effectiveness, but we're now in the 3rd year, as Dwayne said earlier, and what we're seeing now is a lot of output coming out of the project. So in the next 9 months or so, you can expect to see quite a lot of publications, quite a lot of conference activities from the project, and dissemination of learnings that we've had so far. So in terms of how the project is structured, so GetReal is structured into 4 key technical work packages. Additionally, there's a 5th work package which focuses on coordination and dissemination of output, but that's not shown on there. Shall I wait for that to come on?
No, we'll be waiting. Yeah. Just press on, we'll catch it up.
Work package 2. So if we start with work package 2, work package 2 is looking at understanding the efficacy effectiveness gap, and this is really trying to understand when is effectiveness expected to be different from efficacy, and Sarah talked about the difference between efficacy and effectiveness. And really it's about understanding what drives this difference, or what drives this efficacy effectiveness gap. So once you have a better understanding of this, you might understand when and how real-world evidence will be required. And the implication is that if there is no gap, you could be quite happy just using standard RCT data, as that will obviously provide you with both efficacy and effectiveness at the same time. But really the aim is to be able to anticipate this gap earlier in the drug development process, and therefore design development strategies with this in mind. Work Package 2 will test several design options and develop analytical tools, which are then going to be tested in simulation studies in different disease areas. And some of those disease areas include cardiovascular, oncology, schizophrenia, and diabetes.
I understand that we're now actually ahead in the PowerPoints. I'd like to thank
I'll speed up. Okay, moving on. Work Package.
I think we should put a charity drive together for NICE's Internet Fund. We're going to start a crowdsourcing fund for high-speed internet at NICE. Please, Paul.
Sincere apologies. Okay, so Work Package 3 is looking at the operational challenges of using real-world data. And this covers a range of aspects, and these can be issues such as the legal barriers, operational and ethical issues surrounding using real-world data. And the key sort of utility of this work packages is that they're providing solutions to overcome the barriers. The Work Package 3 has a strong focus on pragmatic clinical trials, and they will provide guidance on various aspects of pragmatic clinical trials, evaluation of design options for pragmatic clinical trials, value of information arising from such trials, and recommendations on how to overcome operational challenges in running such studies. And much of this will be wrapped up into a toolkit, which they've called Pragmatic. Work Package 4 is looking at very much analytical side of things. They're very much focusing on modeling and evidence synthesis. There's a strong emphasis on network meta-analysis and developing techniques for incorporating real-world data into network meta-analyses. They're developing methods for incorporating both aggregate data and individual patient data into network meta-analyses, and using case studies to demonstrate the application of these methods in some disease areas. So you will hear more from Work Package 2, 3, and 4 in subsequent GetReal webinars, but the following sort of contents of this will focus on Work Package 1 work. And you can think of Work Package 1 as a center point of the project, really. So we're pulling together the learnings of all the other work packages into what we call a decision-making framework. And this framework is intended to support healthcare decision makers and pharmaceutical R&D in deciding on which real-world data options could be used. The work package will also provide guidance on processes and provide recommendations on further research and policy development. And now I think I've caught up to the slide that you're seeing on the screen now. So in terms of the case studies that we're running in Work Package 1, another key characteristics of Work Package 1 is stakeholder engagement. We've been running a series of case studies where stakeholders are invited to join us to discuss issues in effectiveness research and how we can redesign, really, development pathways to incorporate a greater element of real-world data with the aim of generating better effectiveness estimates. So how we did this is that we looked at historic cases of drugs going through the regulatory and HTA assessments. We identified issues where HTAs or regulators had either insufficient information about the effectiveness of the drug or where there's been uncertainty around the effectiveness. We then proposed an alternative development strategy that involves greater use of real-world data, and this is then tested in workshops with stakeholders to look at acceptability. And this is just to show, the slide shows the process we've gone through. First of all, generating information from publicly available data and information directly from companies. We create summaries of the issues. Workshop 1, we exposed those issues to stakeholders, discuss how we could potentially overcome those with an alternative development design that makes use of real-world evidence. We then go away, do some simulations, and meet up in the second workshop where we discuss the results and actually, first of all, whether the approach that was taken does actually meet the objective of creating better estimates, or whether it is actually helpful or acceptable by stakeholders. In terms of the case study topics that we've chosen, so Work Package 1 has been looking at 5 different disease areas. So we looked at non-small cell lung cancer, we looked at rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, metastatic melanoma, and COPD. Really, the key point here is not that we looked at those different disease areas, but more that we've actually looked at different analytical techniques and study designs as part of those. So in the non-small cell lung cancer case study, we looked at propensity rating, and we looked at to see whether observational data could be incorporated into propensity rating to provide effectiveness estimates for subpopulations based on RCT data. In both the RA and MS case studies, we focused on network meta-analyses and how network meta-analysis could be used with real-world data to generate better effectiveness estimates, especially where we haven't got direct comparisons. In the COPD case study, we looked at early pragmatic clinical trials for measuring effectiveness. And we used the salted lung study in this case as an example of a pragmatic trial. And the questions we asked stakeholders: when and why are these PCTs useful? What are the barriers to stakeholders' acceptance of early trial data, pragmatic trial data? And what are really the barriers to acceptability of pragmatic clinical trials to decision makers? Really, just to summarize our learnings from this, so as Sarah said, I mean, what we've done to date is that we've generated a unique pan-stakeholder workshop environment where the focus is on real-world evidence in medicine development and subsequent assessment. And this is really the first time we've had all the relevant stakeholders together. I'll end there.
Paul, and thank all of you bearing with the slow internet. It's generally running about 3 minutes behind the speaker, so I'm trying to advance in time this, and so we're getting better at it. It's been a learning curve. So Rob, we're now going to pass over to you to give the industry perspective on GetReal and where you think things are moving. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Dwayne. And the title actually of this section is Towards a Real-World Evidence Framework. You won't be able to see that on the screen yet, but it'll pop up shortly. So the purpose of the next 10 minutes, what I'd like to cover in the next 10 minutes, is to introduce the framework, the GetReal framework. As you've just heard from Pal, GetReal will produce a lot of material on effectiveness, and more specifically on relative effectiveness. Things like guidance, tools, links, information on approaches to evidence generation, examples of best practice, and examples of the acceptability of those evidence generation approaches. And we need to help you navigate around this. So that's the purpose of the framework, to help you make your way around this wealth of information, so that whatever your starting point, whether you're in an HTA agency, considering a company's plans for phase 3 and other evidence, whether you're a company thinking about your drug development plan and how you might need to supplement this in order to meet the needs of decision makers beyond the regulator, whatever your starting points, you'll be able to take the framework to get into this wealth of information and guidance and then use it. So just in terms of thinking about the traditional evidence requirements, over the last, traditionally evidence requirements are focused on demonstrating safety and efficacy, but as Sarah mentioned, over the last 10 to 20 years, HTA bodies, payers have proliferated around the world, and they've become more sophisticated in their need for and their use of evidence. And currently there are more and more activities conducted in parallel with the clinical programs, and part of the driver for this has been the need to demonstrate effectiveness, and specifically relative effectiveness of a new therapy compared to current treatments. So that's really why we set up GetReal, to provide these tools and guidance to the different players in those who are using or assessing the evidence. And the framework itself is going to be an online tool that you can use to facilitate the assessment of or the design of alternative development strategies. So think of it as a guide, if you like, to the early use of real-world evidence for demonstrating relative effectiveness, and a tool to get to alternative evidence development strategies and analytical approaches that you can consider and use. So thinking about this in the context of the long and complicated process of drug development, the slide will pop up in a moment. In the past, drug development activities, from preclinical work through to submission and then post-approval activities, were largely aimed at providing evidence of safety and efficacy. And then over the last 20 years, we've seen an extension of the evidence needed for decision making, whether that's for reimbursement, for funding, for coverage, for prescribing decisions. And so health technology assessment activity has expanded around the world. And as a result of that, we've seen changes in the approaches to generating evidence, and also in the acceptability of that evidence. So economic modelling, for example, in the late 90s and early 2000s, methods there to estimate the cost effectiveness and the budget impact as well of a new technology, for example. And then more recently, meta-analytic approaches to assess relative efficacy. And then at the same time, we've seen an extension of the scientific advice processes. Those are the stars on the screen. Those are the opportunities, really more opportunities for dialogue between companies and agencies to assess evidence plans prior to phase 2B, for example, or to discuss or provide input on specific study designs prior to phase 3. But there's still challenges in making decisions about a new drug when we've got limited evidence after the initial development program of its safety and effectiveness. And specifically in the context of GetReal, it's these effectiveness challenges we're trying to help address. And the next slide is not on the screen yet, but it's one that Sarah showed a little bit earlier on effectiveness challenges and how approaches by the various work packages within GetReal will address some of these challenges. So, for example, the second one there, which is real-world evidence likely to be influenced by factors not captured in phase 3. Work package 3 is specifically focusing on different types of studies, pragmatic clinical trials that could be initiated prior to approval. And then we can look at what this would look like in a revised pathway for the development of a particular drug. And you can see we've added in here the arrow for pragmatic studies, and in this case we've got a phase 3B study, effectively a phase 3B study starting earlier prior to approval of the drug, in order that effectiveness data would be available for presentation to HTA agencies, but not as part of the marketing authorization submission though. And then clearly there's an opportunity there at the same time as investing in the pragmatic study to think about shortening the phase 3A clinical trial, because we'll be getting additional evidence through for 3B. So that's not really, that's one example of what we're doing. Of course, that's not the only modification that we're considering under the umbrella of GetReal. We've got other types of real-world studies that's work package 3 is looking at, for example, using real-world data. Pal mentioned about the work that's going on looking at the use of systematic reviews and meta-analyses of randomized and non-randomized studies to help look at different target populations for funding and coverage, to help address endpoints of interest to reimbursement agencies where they might differ from the regulator's view. And then also examples of using real-world data, predictive models, for example, based at least in part on analysis of real-world data to understand, as we said, how efficacy that's seen in the clinical studies might translate to effectiveness in routine clinical use. So on the next slide, just to give you an idea of how the framework might help, I just thought it would be useful just to walk through a simplified example. And in this case, it's from a company planning and evidence generation program, and facing a number of questions on the left-hand side when it pops up on your screen.
If it pops up on your screen. Yes.
So there's the first question they might need to address, for example, is there a need to generate evidence of effectiveness? And of course, this might have been discussed in earlier scientific advice meetings with HTA agencies, and GetReal will produce guidance and tools to help with this. The second question, are there drivers of effectiveness that might be missed in RCTs? And this is a topic that's been considered in detail by Work Package 2, and we will go into this in some detail in the next webinar in the series, which is on the 18th of April. And then we come to how do we get information not only on effectiveness but also on relative effectiveness, and obviously as you've how GetReal has been doing work on analytical methods, and we've also been throughout trying to get some insights into the likely acceptability of the approaches to generating this evidence by the decision makers that need to work with this evidence. So on the right-hand side, you've got a little diagram there, which you'll just have to imagine a series of concentric circles, and this is how I'm trying to depict the real-world evidence framework. So imagine that you're sitting in the center of this circle, and this is the framework. The framework itself will be an online platform, so you won't see it like this, but it's designed to take you through a series of questions. So you start at the center of these series of concentric circles, and right in the middle you've got the pink in the center, is, you know, starting from the different type of challenge that you might face. So we recognize that different people at different points in time face different challenges. So as you can see, that's the sort of salmon pink center circle. And then as you expand out, we look at the different evidence generation approaches, and they're the ones in green. So with detailed guidance that we'll be providing on not just the what to do, but also the how to do it. And as you go further out in the circle, this is in the context of what different stakeholders need. That's in the light blue, and also what might be acceptable. So there'll be a lot of information coming out of GetReal, and the idea of the framework is to help you navigate through this. So then, in summary, the framework is going to be an online platform which will be available to everybody, and it will aid in evidence planning, both for those who are generating evidence and also for those who are responsible for assessing evidence. It will help describe and guide through the different options for study planning, evidence planning, study design, and analytic approaches using real-world data. Complexity, as you probably get, complexity of the range of approaches, we're producing a framework that will help people navigate through all of this. And I think the benefit that will be seen from this will be in drug development programs that better meet the evidence needs of the bodies that review, make decisions about new drugs, and how they're going to be made available, and that in turn should help bring new drugs to patients sooner.
Are we done?
We're done. Yeah, there's one more slide, but well, I've talked through it already.
Well, you're through your pink doorknob now, so we're absolutely fine. Again, everyone, thank you very much. There are several hundred of you online, believe it or not, and we appreciate your patience on this. We understand that this has been a bit of a challenge for us, and we're doing everything we can. I'd like to just ask a few questions here, and I'd like to point out there's a question bar. I will now send you. You can ask your questions here in this question bar, please. answer your questions here. I'm sending out a note now. And this is where we will take questions from all of you. So please answer your questions, ask your questions, and we will certainly endeavor to ask them as they come forward. So all three of you touched on this idea of the potential of GetReal and real-world evidence to impact randomized clinical trial effectiveness. What do you see are the core challenges going forward with some of the stratified, personalized, or precision medicines related to randomized clinical trials, and how could real-world evidence potentially be more effective? How can this help specifically?
So I'll have to go answer that one first, shall I? And you guys chip in. So the issue with precision medicine is we're going to get smaller and smaller number of patients that look like each other. And so we're going to have to think about evidence in quite a different way. And not only the evidence, we're also going to think about care delivery in a very, very different way, which is also going to compound how HTA and payers look at these medicines and manage the entry of those into the healthcare systems. So we've got a need to actually understand how we can make use of every exposure, how we can collect every exposure, make sure we are actually getting the most out of the evidence and use of those drugs as becoming available. So that to me is one of the challenges. The second one, and I think this is just not for precision medicines, I think it's going to be the coordination of stakeholders. So at the moment the systems aren't very aligned, and we have companies making decisions in isolations that then have to go through the regulators, then go through the HTA agencies, then go through the payers, then hit the healthcare systems, and somehow we're going to have to align all those stakeholders so they have a common understanding of evidence requirements, so that they're actually not asking for very disparate things. So we have a chance of actually getting an evidence package that actually provides meaningful information for all those stakeholders.
Yeah, from the industry perspective.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think it's really from an industry perspective, but I think from if you're thinking about stratified medicine, what you need is information on smaller and smaller patient subgroups and eventually the patient level. And one of the most important changes that's happened over the last decade or two is the availability of electronic patient level data. And because we can get patient level data, because we can analyze that and cut it in any way we like, and looking at this data, we can understand what happens to specific patient subtypes, and we can look at different types of care pathways, and that would not have been possible 20 or 30 years ago. So a lot of this work that we can now do looking at effectiveness is only really possible because of the availability of that electronic patient level data.
Excellent. Paul, do you have anything to add on that?
No, nothing about patient stratification or small patient groups, but just to say that there's been a misconception perhaps that we're looking at ways of using real-world evidence to replace this traditional RCTs. I don't think that's necessarily the case. We're looking at, in many cases, complementing RCTs in traditional disease areas, but as Rob says, and Sarah as well, if you're going into ever narrower patient populations, you have to look at something else, and this is where we could be looking at solutions.
And this is where I think the strengths in numbers as well.
Right.
You know, one healthcare system cannot do this. So it's vital we get that coordination and collaboration because the patient numbers just aren't there.
Yeah, I agree. How is that working between the various stakeholder groups? How is that process right now? It's early days, right? No issues. You're all sitting around the campfire singing Kumbaya, and there are no issues. Okay.
And there are marshmallows, yes.
And I think, as Sarah said, you look at GetReal, and I think the experience in GetReal is similar in other IMI projects. This has been a great example of people who wouldn't normally sit down at the table together and tackle projects or problems of common interest. And I think, you know, that's one of the things we've learned in GetReal is that you know, we have got a common interest in sorting out some of these problems, and we have been able to work together across different types of groups.
That's great. Now we do have a ton of questions here, which is fantastic, and quite, again, with 500 registrations we would expect. So I'm going to start rattling through some of these. And again, I thank you, all of you, for your questions. Please keep them coming. We'll start going through the list. This is a question from Agnes Benedict. When will the learnings from the disease-specific case studies in GetReal be presented? When will that be on June 17th? When do you see that?
That's a good question. So for some of those case studies, we've already had a public consultations on draft documents. So that consultation has closed, I think, for 4 out of 5 case studies, or 3 out of the 5 case studies. Those documents will be coming online on the GetReal website imminently within the next couple of weeks or so. So I would encourage people to look at the IMI website. There will be announcements on the website itself when these documents come online, but they're essentially on their way.
We'll push it through in the Twitter feed as well.
Fine.
I think the other thing is that what we're trying to do this year is to present these results. So it's not just a document that's on the IMI website that people can't possibly don't look at every day. But
well, I have it bookmarked, so I.
But we'll also be presenting at conferences. So we've got plans to present the results from the case studies at a number of different conferences in Europe, in the US, and even in Asia. So we recognise that we need to get out to a lot of different audiences here, and the case studies are a terrific way of exemplifying and giving examples of what we've done.
The case studies, just to add to that, they don't touch on all the different issues that you may want to touch on with real-world evidence, but at least, as Rob says, they demonstrate and sort of crystallise how you might want to implement the real-world evidence approaches and what are the pros and cons, and really to get stakeholders' views on the acceptability and usefulness of these options. I think we had a question about who are the stakeholders.
Yeah, how are we defining the stakeholders and who are they?
That's well, we define that really broadly. So we've got decision makers, so we've got the HTA organisations and regulators, they're included, but we've expanded out, so we've incorporated patient views, clinicians, academics, and these are all the different stakeholders and bodies that we brought into our workshops.
We've had a question here, will this be recorded and rebroadcast? Yes, we will, assuming the recording and everything is usable. I'll have to go back and look at the archive. We've obviously been having some internet connectability issues, but we will certainly try and make those available. That's a question from Stephen Weissman. Thank you very much for your question. There's a comment here from Gary Spurrier-Bernard. The problem I see is that many drugs coming off the pipeline do not follow the standard model. Can you base your frameworks around drugs that do not follow a standard model?
I think that's a good point. I mean, every drug is different, and every evidence generation plan is a bespoke plan. You can't take an evidence generation plan that you produce for one compound and simply slot it into any other compound. So it's a fair challenge. And at the end of the day, what the material we've produced, it's not a specific standard evidence generation plan. It's not just there's no such thing as a standard clinical development plan. What they are tools, guidance, best practice, prompts, ideas, case studies, all the sort of things you need to think about as you're having those discussions within the company as to how you plan your evidence generation activities. So it's a fair comment. Every evidence generation plan is going to be different, but what we can do here is provide a lot of information that will allow that discussion you have within the company to be richer, and therefore for you to come up with a better evidence generation plan at the end.
And at the same time, it will allow similar sort of conversation within the sort of regulatory and HTA sphere as well.
And hopefully it will encourage people to have a dialogue more often with different agencies. I mean, we do get insights from different opinion leaders, ad boards, for example, in companies, and other experts. But there's no substitute for taking up the opportunities to talk to people who are going to be advising or making the decisions.
So we've had 3 people here: Bettina Real, hello Bettina, Jan Pavillard, and Cicely Kerr. They've asked, when will the frameworks and tools be available for use? So when do you see the deliverable being handed over to the general public or practitioners?
Well,
we'll jump at that one, please.
We're working really hard, as you would imagine, in our last year of the project. It's been a short time frame for us to work this all up, but we're working very hard to make the initial draft framework available around June this year, and following that we'll have a more finalized version in probably Q3 and Q4.
And that will be going out, being made available, the original version?
Publicly available, yeah.
Yeah, and are we asking people to test this? So are people going to have the opportunity to?
we certainly are open to any comments and suggestions. So please test our material, both in terms of robustness and also in terms of usefulness, because we really want to make sure that what we're producing is useful. So yes, by all means.
And how can they get in contact with you to do so? Would this be through the GetReal platform?
Yes, so the IMI GetReal website has contact details on there. I think it also has names of key staff and people on the project as well.
Fine. Thank you. Now we have a question here from Miguel Amador, who is asking, how do you handle the cost burden of generating this data? Whose responsibility is going to be the data generation and collection?
That is a really interesting question.
That is a very good question,
Thank you, Miguel. Yes, thank you. We're really interested in this, and we feel we don't fully understand the differences. I'm not sure it's an added cost burden. It may be a change in cost burden. So we're working with those very clever folks at MIT New Digs on something called the Janus project, where we're looking at modelling some of these changes and actually seeing to understand if we can understand the change in patient numbers and the overall costs, and therefore the potential impact on different stakeholders. So we can actually start understanding the implications of those decisions. We're also working very hard on the MAPS initiative, that's Medicine's Adaptive Pathways to Patients, which started its life again through the MIT New Digs collaboration as adaptive licensing. And in that, we're looking to actually understand what the role of this data is in the in decision making, so we can actually understand what those trade-offs are. And the important bit about that initiative is around there is the opportunity for the healthcare systems to now start bearing some of the costs and the risks of medicine's development. So we're starting to switch between the standard way we've been doing things with RCTs pre-licensing to actually more of a blend between what was traditionally pre and post licensing. So particularly, I'm using the UK as an example, I'm based in the UK, but there's a wealth of registers that are there in different countries that could be used to generate effectiveness as well as the pharmacovigilance. They're not being used effectively. People are setting up registers de novo. And also, as we're seeing the investment going into electronic healthcare systems, we have the opportunities to actually run more studies in the background. And again, we're seeing things like GSK's put the infrastructure into the sulfid lung study. So sulfid is there now waiting for some of these studies to be done. So I think we're going to see this shift, and it's not necessarily assuming that all the cost is going to be borne by the companies.
And getting into sulfid, you and I were at a conference last week in Budapest, where we saw a presentation of some of the early cut of the data, and from 2,300 patients, roughly, if I'm not mistaken, Andrew Rodham presented data. They've collected 235 million lines of information from this 2,000 patients. It's a simply staggering amount of big data. It was quite shocking. Which then gets to there's a rather provocative question here from a Hidie Mehta, who's asking, how can you conclude, make any causal relationship conclusions from real-world evidence outside of the randomized clinical trial process? So this gets into the adaptive license questions. How are we using RWE in that context? And then how are you addressing the challenges of real-world evidence, I guess, in that sense?
That is the killer question, isn't it? As I mentioned in my presentation, that there are trade-offs. What we're doing at the moment is looking at control cohorts, and many examples those cohorts are actually missing, so we can at least get an understanding of what happens with one intervention versus another. And then we're starting to look into explanatory studies to actually understand where the differences are and why that might happen. So you have to actually understand that data a lot better. I'm very excited about data science. I'm very excited about some of the machine learning techniques. They've yet to be tested in a real live decision-making scenario, so we're looking forward to that. And also the methods development. We've got these trade-offs, so we just need to know how to manage them. And then it's also, the point is about at what point do you do a randomised controlled trial, and certainly in adaptive pathways the focus is is on high unmet need, where those trade-offs, the inputs into those trade-offs might be very different circumstances to later on. So again, as Rob said, each medicine needs to be considered on its own merit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, it's interesting to note that you talked about the Salford lung study, which is a pragmatic clinical trial. That was actually a randomised study.
Yes.
And they were gathering information on effectiveness prior to marketing approval.
Yeah.
So it's not impossible, but as you say, it's got methodological challenges, and obviously there are cost challenges with doing something like the Salford lung study. So.
Certainly.
Yeah.
There's a question here from former Brussels resident, now living in San Diego, Natalie Kayajanian. Hello, Natalie. Thank you for tuning in from San Diego. It's very early. Could patient registries or longitudinal natural history databases be used to capture real-world data?
I think this one's
I think
yes.
Yes, definitely.
And again, Face and States has been collaborating with Outcome, which is now part of Quintiles, and there's a very nice and exhaustive handbook on patient registries which AHRQ produced, which starts to understand potentially what the data in there could be used and how to analyse it. The difficulty we've always found is that sometimes the registers don't contain the parameters that you're actually interested in. So again, we're finding experience. We've been looking in some of our non-drug programs at NICE, particularly interventional procedures and the medical technology, if we're actually establishing registers, working with companies to establish registers to collect data. And we found we've had to adapt some of these registers, which means you've got to have the registry owner be amenable to adaptation.
I think I agree. I think they're a great opportunity, and one of the things that companies should be doing early on in the development process is identifying these potential registries, making contact to see how these could fit into an evidence development program. They won't be the only piece, but there'll be one piece, and working with the registries, because many of them are open to including particular measures, particular endpoints that companies may want to add. If that's going to help make, if that's going to inform healthcare decisions 3 or 4 years down the track, often these registries are open to the idea of having the discussion about whether that can be done.
And importantly, the patient's already signed up to them. So there's a number of examples in the UK where every patient goes into that register. Then the example I'm thinking is the neonatal registers. And you then have that's just done, and people see the importance of it for informing the care that you get. So the patient organisations are all on board, patients are all on board.
And one thing I would think about because a lot of the work that we're doing is looking at global drug development and what could be done to support a new drug in a global sense. And obviously these registries are typically either nationally or regionally based. Some are international, but typically they're national or regionally based. So another issue that companies need to think about and discuss as part of the scientific advice is the transferability of the results and the inferences that you can make from evidence in one country to another.
To another, the applicability across borders.
Exactly.
Absolutely. And this gets to, there's a really great question here. If I'm going to butcher your name, I will do my best not to. Minduagas Pilexis. And I'm very sorry if I've hacked that to pieces, but it's a really excellent question. What do you think of using real-world evidence in patient access programs and or performance-based reimbursement agreements? Now, this gets into some of the things that Italy has done with their national registries with performance-based reimbursement, which I'm aware of. I mean, what do you folks think about that? I'm looking at the nice colleagues here.
Again, it's each case has to be set out. What is the issue and why are we wanting to manage access? What is the effectiveness challenge that's not been met, and why would we want to collect data? So you have to consider each case about what the best situation and setup is for demonstrating that. Governments, certainly in the UK, have traditionally shied away from outcomes-based managed entry agreements, and the very reason is they're complex to set up, they're complex to run, and you need the interaction of a number of different stakeholders. And at the moment, because it's not part of the infrastructure, these are very, very costly to implement. So you start getting into discussions about whose responsibility it is to do that. So again, I think we're going to see a change in that as we go forward. And as part of the Adapt Smart project, which is the IMI Maps project, we're spending on leading a piece of work where we're looking at the different types of managed entry agreements that have been used in Europe, and really getting into the nitty-gritty of what those arrangements are, whether data was part of it or not. So we're going to get a better understanding, both from the company perspective, because we're interviewing companies as well, and from the public perspective about whether or not it is feasible to set such things up.
We are running out of time, and we're still getting hammered with questions. There are still a couple hundred of you online. Thank you very much for bearing through the delayed latency. I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll press on to the end. This is a really nice question from Marissa Papaluca. Were patients involved in GetReal? In your slides, you mentioned HCPs and HTAs, but not patients. What is the role of patients in GetReal?
Given we've got very little time left, the simple answer is yes. Mm-hmm. And we've got patient organisation involved in a number of the work packages. So there will be information coming out on that.
Yeah, we've had strong patient participation in all our workshops, particularly from IAPA, the International Association of Patient Organisations.
And the Melanoma Patient Network. And I know Bettina's on the line,
Bettina,
so thank you,
Bettina,
for all your support with this.
Now, I've just advanced the slide to show the calendar, so I'm now doing an interpretive dance to show the dates for those of you, because you cannot see my, oh, hey, it just came up for some of you. Fantastic. Just to reiterate, we will have a live broadcast on the 18th of April. We'll be doing that from Takeda, and we will make sure we have good high bandwidth before we try and run video, guaranteed. The 10th of May, we'll be doing another webinar, and this will be about real-world evidence and network meta-analysis. That should be extremely exciting. And then the first public conference, June 17th, right here in London at the Digital Catapult right across from St. Pancras Station. We'll be sending out this information to all of you who are participating today. Again, I'd really like to thank you all for your participation and your patience. We're sorry that we were having latency issues. We will be sending out the PowerPoints as well as at least an audio archive of this webinar, so you can follow along, and we'll certainly get that out. And we will be circulating the questions internally to members of the GetReal staff and participants to whom we were not able to answer those questions today, and we will endeavor to get you responses as soon as we can. So with that, on behalf of the team here, Sarah, Paul, and Rob, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And again, this meeting is now adjourned. Thank you very much.